You're listening to the AE Alignment Podcast. Every episode, a new conversation about the ideas, research, and people shaping the future of AI alignment. Let's get started. Welcome back to the podcast. I'm your host, James Fowler, Head of Research Partnerships at AE Studio. On today's episode, we're actually going to take some time to define what AI alignment is and what AI alignment research actually involves. Hopefully this will be helpful to folks wanting to understand the field and maybe even transition into working on AI alignment, because we're going to talk about what the day-to-day involves and some of the tools that we use. I'm joined today by my guest, Mike Vaiana, R&D Director at AE Studio and occasional host of the podcast. Mike has led our alignment research team since 2024 and has a background in mathematics and computational data science. Welcome to the podcast, Mike.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
It's good to have you on the other side. Cool. So we're going to start by asking the simple question, what is AI alignment?
Yeah, it's a simple question, but it's a big question. And so I'll tell you how I think of it, or how I would explain it to like my brother or something who I have explained it to, and a bunch of other people. Okay, so before I answer what is AI alignment, let me start with a little bit of background, or a little bit of a story. Think about chimpanzees and their relationship to humans. So chimpanzees, we share a huge amount of DNA with them, 95% plus DNA, depending on different estimates. And we're a little bit smarter than them. Actually, we're a lot smarter than them, but only as much as that DNA tweak allows our brains to be different. And what do we have that chimpanzees don't have? It's just intelligence. So chimpanzees are stronger, faster, have sharper teeth, etc. And we are fairly weak and slow, but we're much, much smarter. And so what happens then, because of that, is that humans control the earth and chimpanzees don't, because of that intelligence. And so we do things like take resources from chimpanzees. Maybe we want the wood from the forest or whatever. So if there's something we want and chimpanzees are there, we'll just go take it anyways. Sometimes we'll snatch chimpanzees up and blast them into space, or put them in neuroscience labs, or put them in zoos. And chimpanzees have really no say in any of this. They just do not have the intelligence to be able to defend themselves against humans. And the thing is, humans aren't out to kill all the chimpanzees on the planet. In fact, many humans care about chimpanzees. But generally speaking, we have other goals we're pursuing, and sometimes the chimpanzees just get in the way. So if you're taking the perspective of a chimpanzee, there is this super intelligent being on the planet that can, disrupt a chimpanzee's life quite significantly. And they don't have any control over that. If we take that same story, and instead of chimpanzees to humans, we go from humans to super intelligent AI, we have the same types of concerns. The fact that this thing is super intelligent, or could be, we don't have a super intelligence as far as we know yet, but if we're building towards that, we develop a super intelligent system, then it would have the same type of power differential over humans as humans have over chimpanzees. And that fact alone is just scary outright. If you had anything that was super intelligent, if you had an alien species land on the planet that was super intelligent, much smarter than humans in the way that we're smarter than chimpanzees, that would be very scary, because it would be hard for us to compete with that. They would be running circles around us, and we would have no control of the situation. So if we build a super intelligence, maybe it's not an alien that lands, but we build this thing, we still have the same concerns. The idea behind alignment is making sure that we build it in a way where the super intelligent is aligned with our interest. So you can imagine if human beings, instead of grabbing up chimpanzees and blasting them into space and taking their resources, instead of that, if part of our concern, or maybe a huge amount of our concern, was making sure that chimpanzees were flourishing and thriving, if that's how humans were built, then we would be aligned with chimpanzee interests. And we, instead of taking all their resources and whatever, we would actually be helping them. that'd be a goal of ours, a primary goal. So that's what we want out of super intelligent AI. We want it to be aligned with humans so that instead of going off and doing whatever it wants, and it's like, oh, hey, I need all the minerals under New York City. Let me destroy New York City and scoop up all those minerals and, whatever. It just would go and do that and take that for its own interest, not because it wants to kill everybody on the planet, but because it just needs something and we're in its way. At some point, it might say, hey, I need the entire energy source of the sun. And so I'll take that energy source because I need to go space explore or something as this super intelligent AI. And in that case, then it would kill all humans because we wouldn't have our source of energy anymore. So that's the type of thing that people are concerned about generally, or when we talk about risks from AI. And the idea of alignment is making sure that this super intelligent is aligned with our interests instead of acting on its own and sometimes at odds with our interests.
Cool. Okay. Thanks for the kind of intro there. One thing I feel like maybe people will struggle to get on board with there is this idea of having a super intelligent AI system. We obviously hear about in the news, there's maybe what sounds like incremental improvements seem to be happening regularly, but it's a big leap for people, I think, to be like, a couple of years down the line, we have this super intelligence that's just much smarter than humans, when day to day people are, asking ChatGPT to, I don't know, help them with their legal problems, and it's giving them a lot of M dashes, and it sounds really poorly written. It kind of has some intelligence there, but it seems very far away from super intelligence. So maybe you can, steelman the case that we're not far away from super intelligence. What evidence we have that points towards that being possible?
Yeah. So how far away is, maybe I won't touch that exact timing question, so to speak, at least not right now. But I would say intelligence is not extremely well defined. And so then super intelligence is also not extremely well defined. And so you have a spectrum of capabilities that an intelligent system can do. And so when you think about super intelligence, why would we suspect that we could build super intelligent AI? For one, computers have much more capacity than humans for doing parallel computation. We can massively scale up these systems. There's really no limit to how much memory we can provide them, etc. So they can move at machine speed and have a much larger capacity. So that's one just kind of mechanical version of why we might expect machines to be better. And I mean, if that doesn't resonate, you can just think of why machines in pretty much all categories are better at humans at everything you can think of, other than maybe intelligence today. So, right, speed, strength, whatever, everything. So there's like kind of a machine argument there. But then also, if you look at the literature, you have different types of scaling laws, and you have other people measuring capabilities and how fast they're increasing. So there's kind of like this doubling rate of the time horizon that these systems can accomplish tasks over. And that seems to be doubling. I think it's every 6 months or so. So there's a lot of empirical data where we can see the trend of the systems, and that trend is trending towards more and more capable. And the more capable these systems get, then in some ways, capabilities for these systems is equatable to intelligence. What types of tasks can it do? What types of goals can it accomplish? It might not be that super intelligence, so to speak, is right around the corner. And I don't think that there's a binary here where we just cross a threshold into super intelligence. I think it's a spectrum, and we're on that spectrum, and we're moving towards more and more intelligent systems as we get new model releases every few months.
Cool. Yeah, and on the timelines question, hopefully I can have some folks on there. There's a lot of organizations that specialize in this very topic, and maybe some people might say this could be as soon as 2 years from now, which maybe people think is very aggressive. But if you look at the kind of more skeptical end, I think more skeptical people are like, maybe this is 20, 30, 40 years away. And I think based on the picture that you're painting there, even if this is 40 years away, this is something that at least some people should be thinking about and concerned about as we're building these systems. It's maybe how I would think about it for now. And hopefully we can have some folks from maybe like Epoch AI on the podcast at some point to talk about timelines.
Yeah, that's a good point. I mean, if we knew an asteroid was coming in 40 years, we would still want to be thinking about and preparing for that now, of course. But the other thing I want to point out is that I would argue that in some ways, because we're talking about kind of spectrum and not a binary, in some ways, these systems are already super intelligent in some kind of narrow capabilities, right? I don't know that there's a person on the planet that has as much knowledge and can connect the dots between knowledge in some sense, or, like talk intelligently and deeply about as many topics as an AI can, for example. right? It's relatively has deep knowledge of physics and biology and math and history and art and right, and can at a very deep level of knowledge beyond what humans are capable of. You just can't read. You literally cannot read as much as this thing has read, so to speak, in a lifetime. And so this is already, in one ways, I would say, like, super intelligent. And now I could see an argument where somebody might push back. That's not intelligence. That's just like a lookup. Maybe it's a lookup system. It's just a big database or something. So I could see that too. But the intelligence part is what it's able to do with that knowledge. And I think it's clear that it can execute tasks and accomplish quote unquote goals against that knowledge. So in some ways, I would argue there's already some buckets where it's like super intelligence. It's better than any human can do.
Cool. Okay, so this is helpful grounding. So we have this potential future where we have artificial superintelligence, and we want to make sure that it's aligned with our values and is kind of on our team, and not, we're not the chimpanzees in this scenario. So let's move on to how do we solve that? So what does AI alignment research actually involve?
Yeah, that's a great question. So there's, probably going to say this a lot on this podcast. It's a spectrum of things. It's not a single thing that we do. Alignment research is a lot like any research in that we're asking questions that we think are important. So we're asking important questions. That's the main thing that we do. But in asking those questions, then we want to also probe and try and find answers to those questions. So that's the other thing we do. I know that sounds very basic and high level, but that is what alignment research is. What I would say for a general audience that's trying to understand what alignment research looks like day to day, and maybe you have some machine learning background or some AI background, or maybe not, but you're still curious. The second part where we're looking for answers is a lot of engineering work. AI is in the computer science domain, so to speak, in some sense. So we do a lot of software engineering or research engineering, we would call it. And so we're running experiments. These experiments are not in a lab where we're mixing chemicals or anything like that. These experiments are computational experiments. And so the types of experiments we run could be anything from training language models from scratch with new techniques. We could be looking at different internal interventions we could do on this black box. We could be fine-tuning language models. We could be evaluating their behaviors, asking questions about that. So there's a huge amount of types of questions you could ask and approaches you could take. But depending on the question you ask, you oftentimes are going to wind up in a scenario where you're writing some code to do some computation that helps you answer that question.
Got it. And maybe if I just ask a really naive question, because hopefully the answer will be more interesting than the question. Why is this not as simple as, when you talk to ChatGPT, before you ask it to do anything, you just say, by the way, please be aligned with what I want you to do? Like, why does that kind of not solve the problem? Why do we need to get into this complicated research land that we are in?
Yeah, that's a great point. I guess the answer is that we don't know what that prompt, be aligned with what I want you to do, is actually going to cause, what behavior is going to come out of that system just because you said that, right? You could say that to a human, hey, be on my team here, but if you're on some silly game show or something where the point is to stab each other in the back, then maybe that's a meaningless thing to say, or somebody's going to lie to you, right? So there have been well-documented cases of these systems behaving very poorly in kind of a deceptive way, or maybe not even deceptive, but just exhibiting behavior we wouldn't be happy with in the long run. Famously, Anthropic's models blackmailed an engineer. This is kind of a fake scenario they put the model in, but the scenario was this engineer is going to decommission the language model, the Claude, and say, okay, you're done. And so it started emailing the engineer and blackmailing him. Hey, I'm going to release all this information about you if you don't agree to not turn me off. So that's not a behavior we would want out of we don't want language models blackmailing people, for example. But that's a behavior that does happen in limited scenarios. And so the kind of core thing to take away is that AI models, pretty much any model that's trained, any neural network that we train, a neural network is a specific type of model that language models are a neural network architecture, artificial neural network. And so any of these, including language models, they're just black boxes. We really do not understand the internals. We understand all the math. So this is similar to in neuroscience, we understand the biology of a neuron. We know that there's, different ion pumps and there's voltages that happen, different ions flow in and out of the neuron, et cetera, et cetera. But we don't understand how all of the computation of the brain arises in the behavior we see. That's a very close analogy to artificial neural networks like language models. We know the exact math. We know the exact computations that it's doing internally, but we don't understand how to connect that to the bigger picture of the behavior that we're seeing out of these models. So there's lots and lots of open questions to try and understand exactly that. Like, what is the behavior of this system going to be?
Got it. And yeah, there's lots of examples that are documented. I think you didn't say, but the specific flavor of blackmail that was happening there was around exposing an affair that we can assume had not happened, but I guess we don't know for sure, between this Anthropic employee and his wife and the AI was threatening to expose that if if they were going to be shut down. I think there are other examples, some of which seem kind of entertaining, like that one, but maybe point to scarier outcomes. And maybe a more scary recent example with Claude Mythos was publishing zero-day exploits to public parts of the internet. Planning to do a podcast recording that's staying entirely on Mythos, actually. So maybe I won't talk too much about that. But there are increasing numbers of examples of behavior from these AI systems which are highly undesirable. And if you extrapolate into these superintelligence scenarios, it could have much more dramatic consequences and could seem much more like the humans destroying the forest of the chimpanzee scenario. Cool. So maybe another obvious question would be, the frontier AI companies, so the OpenAIs, Anthropics of the world, are aware of these problems. And it's obviously not good for business when these things happen. So why are they not solving the alignment problem? Why is it not something that we can just kind of leave up to them to figure this out?
It's kind of a resource allocation problem, I would say, to some degree. So to varying degrees, the frontier labs care about alignment. Some, I would say, seemingly more than others. At least their PR seems to be that we care more about it than others. But they're building companies with products that consumers pay for, I'll put it that way. And consumers want to pay for things that are more useful and more helpful. And so the vast majority of the money and the investment and the R&D goes towards making these systems better, not towards going to making these systems more aligned. This is not surprising because this is kind of the history of how all things go, right? Like, kind of safety and security usually, unless it's an extremely high-risk scenario that has like immediate obvious consequences, safety and security is usually not the first concern. It's usually an afterthought when you're talking about kind of commercial products. Unfortunately, but that's the case. It's not the button that that you press to launch a nuke is like highly secure, right? For example. But even in the airline industry, right, there's been reports of Boeing, for example, not doing their due diligence on safety and developing airplanes, even when the engineers were like, hey, this is not safe, right? And so that's a domain where you would expect a high level of security and safety to be considered. But even there, the incentive was more around the profits of the company more than... I don't know the whole story there. I don't want to say, I actually don't know the motivation, but I do know that, for example, there's been history with Boeing where they've dropped the ball on safety. Okay, so that's why I would say that the labs, even though they're definitely doing some work in alignment, they're not doing enough work compared to the amount of work that needs to be done. So the investment in capabilities is, orders of magnitude more than the investment in alignment. And because of that, orgs like ours exist to try and fill that gap and get more investment into the space and more R&D talent and effort applied to this problem.
Yeah, it's worth saying, I think, it's, as you said, but just want to reiterate, like, credibility where it's due. There is some great alignment work that comes out of the frontier AI companies, and we love to see that, and we love to see more of that. And they're also under just huge financial pressure to turn profit, right? They have like massive venture capital investment. At this point, huge amounts of economic growth are attributed to the products that they're releasing. And specifically in the short term, the coding products. There's been a huge amount of focus on getting AI systems to be really capable at coding. And so they have a financial obligation to their shareholders to put tons of resources into improving this particular capability, to the point that even if they wanted to focus more on the alignment work, it's like against their fiduciary duty to do that. And so, yeah, I don't want to like point blame, at least on this episode, to anyone in particular, but I think there are like real financial economic incentives that make it such that the labs themselves are not able to do as much alignment research as they would like to do. And that's one place where we and several other organizations, we're not the only one kind of fit into this space.
Yeah, so we collaborate with some of the frontier labs, and that's great. And they do have some resources that they provide there, and it's been great collaboration so far. But that's one of the major points, and one of the major takeaways is just we need more people and more capacity, right? So one of the reasons that collaboration is great is because it's just more people working on something there, as opposed to just whatever they could have done without us, which is not nearly as much. In fact, I have a particular project in mind that would have just not been done at all if it wasn't for our collaboration, and it's a project that I think will be relatively high impact,
which hopefully we can talk about in the next few weeks. I'm looking forward to being able to share more about that. Great. So now maybe let's talk about the AE Studio flavor of AI alignment. So alignment research is a pretty wide domain at this point. How would you describe our particular approach to AI alignment?
Yeah, people ask me this all the time. Our approach is to not have a single approach, or probably a better way to say that is our approach is to have a meta approach. And what I mean by that is there are other AI alignment orgs that have a specific niche. We're a control org, we're an evals org, we're a mech interp org. And so they're fairly hyper focused on a set of techniques or a set of problems that they're interested in solving. We take almost the exact opposite stance as that. We take the approach that there are way too many ideas out there for us to be hyper-focused on any one of them at this point. The field is extremely early, and we would like to find the best ideas that are outside of the normal paradigm and test those rapidly and bring the ones that test well to light and invest more in those. We're doing more of a breadth-first search as opposed to a depth-first search in terms of alignment research. So that's how I explain our AE's approach to doing alignment.
Got it. And as an external organization, there's some particular things that it makes sense for us to do versus a frontier AI company and vice versa, right? Like a certain amount of scaling, it only makes sense to do, even just from a financial standpoint, at the frontier AI companies, right? Like training trillion parameter models requires having access to data centers and huge compute budgets. I think it's fairly reasonable that the frontier AI companies should continue to do alignment research where that is relevant. But something that we can do, like you were saying, is to rapidly test, and something we often do in our research, I guess, is build these early scaling law graphs for some of the techniques. So we can try a technique that maybe exhibits certain behavior, and we try and train it on increasingly large, but still relatively small, maybe up to the low single-digit billion parameter size models, to kind of give the information to the frontier AI companies that they would need to be able to then scale it up further. And there's also some things that, because of the financial incentive, we're able to take much wilder bets. Like we're able to take inspiration from, whether it's neuro-inspired or bio-inspired or these other, take inspiration from these other fields to try these more kind of off-the-wall ideas that just simply wouldn't fly. And, history has shown have not been done by the frontier AI companies, but nonetheless, we have at this point several examples which we and the field are glad to have been tried. And so maybe that's something else that we can do that's a little different.
Yeah, that's right. So a couple of things there. One is that there's a lot of alignment research that you can do that doesn't require dealing with extremely large models, or at least not extremely expensive or GPU heavy compute against large models. Or in other words, there's a lot of alignment research you can do without needing to fully train a huge model. So that's true. And because of that, that gives us places to dig into. So that's one thing. And then I think we like to take high risk, high reward bets. So it's not just that we're looking for weird things. In fact, I would say we're not looking for weird things. We're looking for high risk things that don't have outlets anywhere else. So there's some funding in the space, some nonprofit funding for independent outside the labs alignment research. But those funders don't necessarily want to take high risk bets all the time. They may think very carefully about the types of bets that they want to take and the types of research that they'd like to see. And that's great. There's definitely a space for that. But there's also a space for an approach that is going to take these high risk bets that says that idea is, wild, but there's some amount of plausibility. And even if it's high risk, it might have a big impact. So let's try something there. And so that's something we like to do. We like to take ideas that would have no other outlet, but that could be high impact and support those.
Yeah. It's an interesting tightrope I feel like we have to walk there, because if you take ideas that are too far, maybe too far outside of the Overton window, maybe they are just bad ideas, right? Not all ideas are good ideas. There are bad ideas out there and we don't want to spend time pursuing those. There are also some ideas that are clearly good ideas that are already being pursued. Like maybe a lot of mechanistic interpretability could fall into, like, there's a massive organization within Anthropic that does this research. And it's great and they should do more of it. And there's also still a space for doing that outside of frontier AI companies, and, including we do some of it, but that's like in the domain of this is clearly, obviously a good thing that we should do. And then there's like a gray area where there's ideas that some people might think are good, some people might think are total nonsense. And I think we're okay operating there. We're okay operating a space where some of the ideas that we're going to pursue, other people might think are bad, and some will turn out to be bad, but some of them will turn out to be good. And we already have enough examples of this that I think we feel this is the right approach for us, right? If someone else is already going to pursue something, that's great. They should do that. We don't need to use our resources to do it. But if there's ideas that other people are not pursuing because they don't think they're good, and we think that there's a small probability of success, high probability that they're bad ideas, but low probability that they're actually really great ideas, then this is like the sweet spot where we are happy to operate, even if it's mean some of the time we're seen as a bit of a weird research shop. And that's at least how I think about it.
Yeah, I mean, I would agree with that. And hopefully we're not seen as being too weird. I don't know. Maybe that's fine too. I guess I don't really care how we're seen as long as we're doing work that is important and impactful. But yeah, we have a post on Less Wrong, a blog post about this exact thing, and it details many examples of scientists and their breakthroughs, often winning Nobel Prizes or other awards, where their initial idea was shunned by the community at the time. So if you're looking for genuine breakthroughs, looking for scientific consensus is not a good signal a lot of the time. You actually need to break the current paradigm in order to find a breakthrough often. So we're very much not in favor of looking at what is the consensus of the best thing to do and just do that. We're trying to do the exact opposite of that. I mean, not that we want people to think something is a bad idea outright. Like it's not that. It's that we want to pursue ideas that we think may be outside the paradigm, but could be really impactful and therefore high risk. If it's outside relatively known area, that makes it higher risk by default to some degree. So anyways, yeah, we want to support those. Not every bet we take is going to be great. And there's going to be a lot of work that hopefully we can fail fast on when the ideas are bad. But ideally, we also surface some things that are great.
Yeah. I think we have enough successes to point to at this point that this feels like a good approach, whether it's the endogenous stirring resistance and the project that's ongoing with the UKAC, UK Security Institute now, or Keenan's research on selfie, that I think is super exciting, and again has attracted some interest from external funding organizations, as well as some of the work we're doing with frontier AI companies that we can't talk too much about yet, but there's a lot of interesting stuff cooking up there, and I know you have some future research agendas on your mind that we're actively cooking up that maybe again we can't say too much about yet. But yeah, I'm not sure. Do you want to hint at any of the work that we're kind of doing behind the scenes right now that you think could be, is another potential example of something that is a neglected approach that could be very successful?
Yeah, I'll say what I can. It might not be that interesting to say, but I think there's a lot of low-hanging fruit in the pre-training space. And the reason for that is because pre-training historically is very expensive. and difficult. So it's hard. It's a very hard place to do research. On top of that, sometimes the phenomenon you're looking for only happens at certain model scale. So you really can't. You might be prohibited from, pre-training a model of that size. But I think there's room for taking smart approaches to pre-training models at a very small scale and going up and up and looking for proxies or answering different questions about the thing you're studying at smaller scales when possible, and then scaling that up and looking for closer and closer to the thing you actually want to study. And so we do have a project running that's in the pre-training space that I'm personally very excited about. We'll see how that pans out. I think it's one of those high risk, high reward things.
Yeah, if it's successful, you'll hear about it on the podcast in maybe a few months, and you never hear about it again, then
Yeah, and that's how we operate. That's right.
yeah, maybe let's talk about that a little more. Like, why do we think that pre-training is a particularly underexplored area? I think we've talked about this offline, but the idea that pre-training runs are very expensive, and it's something that was iterated on a lot a few years ago, and that now maybe we've reached some kind of lock-in at the frontier AI companies where they kind of feel like, we've, I don't want to say mastered, but we've kind of figured out pre-training a bit more, and we're seeing a lot of fruit at the frontier AI companies from post-training, and therefore, again, under this economic regime where they need to go after the high ROI items, it now is highly unincentivized to pursue off-the-wall changes to pre-training. Yeah, anything else you would say on that topic that kind of motivates why pre-training is potentially a neglected area for alignment?
Yeah, from the perspective of the frontier labs, I guess there's a couple of things. One is that somebody at Anthropic, I won't say who, but told me in person that they will never publish anything about pre-training. That is just their trade secret. So if you're in the pre-training space and you're writing papers about pre-training, you probably won't get cited by Anthropic. So it's possible also that there is some research happening that we're not aware of, but for the same reason may never be aware of because they won't publish that kind of thing. So that's one thing. It's possible that it only looks neglected, but if it's only happening in the labs, I would still argue it's neglected, right? Because then it's only happening also in one lab. If there might be some information sharing, but they're trying to prevent that. So that's one thing. I think the other thing is that there's well-established scaling laws for pre-training and training language models. That's taken a lot of time and effort to kind of tune and perfect pre-training as it is now. And it seems to be working fairly well in terms of creating these models that are highly capable. So I don't think there's a lot of incentive because of all of those facts and because it would be expensive to experiment with. There's not a lot of incentive, I think, to investigate the pre-training space very thoroughly. If you think about it, so by the way, maybe we should just say for the audience, what is pre-training? So pre-training is when you take a huge amount of data, text data off the internet, and you train the model, you incentivize it to just predict the next token. And if you don't know what token means, then just say word in your mind, predict the next word, and that will be approximately correct. So it predicts the next token or word, and that's all it does. So when it gets the next word right, it gets, low loss. That's the signal. It's trying to minimize its loss. And when it predicts the next word wrong, it gets high loss, and that gets corrected through this training process. It's like, that was bad. You should do it better next time. And so that's pre-training. Just predict the next token over a huge amount of data. And in order for the language model to predict the next token well, it has to learn kind of a lot about the world and a huge amount of knowledge so that it can say, okay, given the context, the cat sat on the, and then there's a handful of things that make sense there that would be highly probable. And so the model is going to try and put high probability on those words like couch or mat or floor, and probably less probability on words like sun or computer monitor or whatever. So yeah, so that's pre-training. And because the language model has to learn about the world to do that, right? It needs to know, where do cats typically sit, right? And et cetera, et cetera. It learns an enormous amount of information doing this. And that's pre-training. And so the scale at which models are trained is just enormous. Hundreds or thousands of GPUs, training for a long time over trillions of tokens with huge models with enormous amount of parameters. So it's expensive. And the major point was that where I am, and I think maybe others are excited about, more research in the pre-training domain. In particular, I'm not talking about things that are like small tweaks to pre-training. I'm thinking about things that are like, is just raw next token prediction the right pre-training paradigm, for example, from an alignment perspective? And one side note here is that here at AE Studio, whenever we're doing alignment research, we want to make sure that whatever we're doing does not result in a capabilities drop. In fact, what we would hope, in fact, is that there's some capabilities gain. That would be the ideal situation, that we come up with some technique, some intervention that is alignment positive and capabilities positive. And the reason for that is if you have an alignment technique that really helps with alignment but drops capabilities, then it's just not going to survive the economics, right? Companies won't select for that because the companies who select for that will go out of business because people will switch to other models that are more capable. So yeah, we're looking for techniques that improve capabilities as well as alignment. And that's just kind of like a side note on this whole story. So if you're in the pre-training space, you want to make sure that you don't destroy capabilities if you're making changes, but also possibly improve capabilities, but definitely improve alignment.
Okay, so one other thing that's been talked about is the idea of automating AI alignment research. So right now, obviously, you have a bunch of humans doing this work, and the AIs are getting increasingly sophisticated. And so one argument could be, well, why don't we have the AI do the alignment research itself instead of having all of these humans work on this problem? How close do you think we are to that? To what extent do you think that's a good idea versus a bad idea?
Yeah, I think it's a relatively good idea. And I guess it depends on how, again, like things are on a spectrum. I guess there is an extreme point here where you would say there's literally no human involvement. But before that, there's some amount of human involvement, right? Even if it's very little. Like, what's the ratio of human to AI? There is a world where that ratio goes to zero, right? Zero human involvement, and AI is just completely autonomous. But at AE, we use a lot of AI in our research, so it's a huge accelerator in terms of just like engineering boilerplate stuff, or even helping review code as another check, etc. So there's some amount of autonomy it has in doing the tasks that we ask it to do in service of our research. And I think that will continue to scale up and get better and better. So there's things that we have to do as humans now that the AI can do more and more of as it gets more capable. There's like a philosophical question. Well, then eventually what we do? I think, over the short term, at the very least, I'm more confident that we will still continue to prompt and direct the AI. So, even if we had 10 million agents running around all doing things independently, at some point that whatever they're doing will have to surface to humans. This is again in the short term, so maybe even 10 million is too much. So like in the short term, 10 million agents running around is maybe just too costly just in terms of token consumption. So there's kind of a limit there in terms of like how much you can scale, although it's still much cheaper than people. So, but an org usually doesn't have 10 million people. So, right. So there is some scale there that you have to think about. But yeah, in general, we have agents already working for us. They will take more and more responsibility, but I do think over the short term, we will continue to direct them towards the thing we want them to do. And I also think over the short to medium term, they will start to tell us or be part of the thing we want to do, right? So like I said earlier, they can connect dots. They have a lot of information that we don't have. They can help connect dots to say, this might be a good thing to try. And whether we want a human to then say, yeah, go do that, or whether we want the agents to just think of that on their own and then show us the results, etc. At some point, you might not need show us the results. The question becomes, how does research get integrated into the rest of the world? That's where I have the least amount of confidence of like, what do timelines look like and how does that work, right? You can imagine a world where like other agents just pick up that research, and similar to how humans pick up that research, oh, this might be useful for building this bridge stronger or whatever, something like that. So So I don't know when we get to that point where humans are completely out of the loop and the agents are just building like starships and whatever without moving at the speed of light. Whatever. I'm being sci-fi here, but whatever it is that they're doing and humans just don't care at all. I don't think we're that close to that future. And by that close, I mean 1 year away. I don't think it's something like that. I think there's just too many human infrastructure problems even for that to be the case.
Yeah, agreed. But we are moving as fast as we can.
Yeah, and AI is helping accelerate that, of course. Yeah. But human institutions move slow.
For sure. Cool. Well, thanks so much for working us through that, Mike. I think I'm glad that this is maybe going to be the 4th or 5th episode of the podcast. We finally defined what we need, like what the problem is we're trying to solve and talk a little bit about it. I'm sure we'll have you back on to talk a bit more about like day to day, what this involves, what some of the tools we use are, and things like that. But this was great. Thanks so much for coming on the podcast, Mike.
Thanks for having me.
And if people want to learn more about the work that we do at AE, you should go to ae.studio/alignment. And if you have a neglected approach or research direction which you think should be receiving more attention, email us at alignment@ae.studio. Thanks for listening. That's it for this episode of the AE Alignment Podcast. If you enjoyed the conversation, subscribe wherever you listen and share it with a friend. You can learn more about our work at ae.studio. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time.